Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi Masechet Megillah, 1 week at a time. Today is our third lesson, and we are going to be reviewing Daf 17 through 23, which was today's Daf. And welcome everyone. So at the top of 17, we didn't finish the chapter last week, so we'll just finish up the chapter. The top of 17 continues talking about the greatness of learning Torah, that it is greater than honoring one's parents. We know that honoring one's parents is extremely important, and here the Gemara is trying to say it's so important, but learning Torah is even more important than that. And it's learned from the fact that Yaakov, learned for 14 years in a study hall, in a yeshiva of Aver, which is much older than Yaakov. And the end or the top of 17 really gives us a calculation how we know that Yaakov actually sat and learned the Torah. Which is interesting because the Torah wasn't given yet, but one can say he learned tradition, he learned about religion, but the calculation is very interesting. It tells us that Jacob was 63 when he left home, and he was 20 years in Lavan's house, and basically in the whole calculation, there are 14 years that are missing, and the Gemara tells us that in those 14 years, he was actually learning, and therefore, it was okay that he wasn't in his parents' home. With that, we finished the first chapter of our Masechet of Megillah. We are going to start and actually finish the second chapter, and we're going to talk about again. The first chapter was really all about the Megillah itself. Last week, for those of you who didn't listen to the class, we went through a lot of the stories or the background of the story of the Megillah, of the story of Esther, the story of Esther. This week, we're going to talk about the laws of what does the Megillah, the scroll, you can see here in the picture, the scroll of the Megillah, what does it actually have to look like? How do we read it? So the second chapter starts on Daf 17. The Mishnah tells us that you do not fulfill your obligation of reading the Megillah if you read it out of order, right? So there are 10 chapters to the Megillah. You need to read them in order. Or you cannot read it by heart. Again, you have to read it from the scroll, and you cannot read it by heart. Nor can you read it in another language. You have to read it in Hebrew. Maybe the Mishnah says maybe you can read it in another language if you don't understand Hebrew. Maybe foreigners, meaning people who do not understand Hebrew, maybe they can read it in another language. The Mishnah continues and tells us that if you dozed off in the middle of the Megillah and then you wake up and you can continue, that's okay. The Gemara is going to explain what this means. And the last line of the Mishnah is that the Megillah must be written in Hebrew, on parchment, and in ink. Again, as you see here in the picture, this is a picture of a Megillah, and it looks very similar to a Torah scroll, right? Meaning it must be written on parchment, very similar to a Torah scroll. Okay, so the Gemara explains how do we know that we need to read the Megillah in order? That if you read the Megillah itself, it says that you have to write it down and understand it the way it was written and in its time. So the way it's written means that it has to be read in its order. And therefore, you cannot go back and forth or change the order. So too, when we say Hallel, Hallel is the prayer that we say on the new month, on Rosh Chodesh, which was actually this week, or during the festivals. Again, Hallel is different chapters in Psalms, and they must be said in order. So too, the Shema, the prayer of Shema, has 3 paragraphs. Those need to be said in order. And so too, when we say Shmona Esrei, which is the silent Amida, the Gemara is going to go through all of these things, but the silent Amida has 19, right, 18 or 19 blessings. Those need to be said in order. Um, the Gemara explains why. So let's go through each one. Why does Hallel, again, Megillah, we know why it needs to be in order. We just said from actual verses in the Megillah. Hallel needs to be in order as well. Shema, here, since the Gemara brought up Shema, again, Shema is when we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, right here, O Israel, right? The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. After that, there are 3 paragraphs that we normally say. The Gemara says that there's a machloket, there's a difference of opinion if it can be said in any language or it must be said in Hebrew. It says the word Shema. We need to hear it. So first of all, that might mean that I need to understand it, and therefore I can say it in any language. Or the word Shema, hear, O Israel, means I need to hear it, and therefore there is a custom or a law that when we say that prayer, we should say it out loud, not quietly to ourselves, but out loud so that we can actually hear the prayer. Okay. The Torah, right? Since we're talking about the Megillah needing to be in Hebrew, so too the Torah, meaning the Torah scroll, needs to be written in Hebrew. Again, or maybe it could be said in any other language. And again, that's the difference of opinion. We mentioned the Shmona Esrei, the silent Amida. Shmona Esrei really means 18. The 18 blessings, interestingly, it is 19 blessings. One was added a little later on. But the silent Amida needs to be said in order. And the Gemara here on Daf 17 explains how do we know the order that it needs to be. So if you look at Psalms chapter 29, it talks about, and basically the Gemara goes through each verse and explains how each one is the order of the silent Amidah. So it says, right, Havul Hashem b'nei Elim, right, the mighty ones are going to praise God. Who are the mighty ones? The Avot, the forefathers. And that's why the first blessing of the silent Amida talks about the forefathers, right? Havul Hashem kavod va'oz. When we praise God, it should be with strength. And therefore, the next blessing is called Gvura, meaning the mighty deeds of God. The next line is that again we praise God with in sanctity, right? And therefore the next blessing is about kedusha, about holiness of God. And then from there the Gemara continues and tells us that after the blessing of sanctity, of kedusha, comes knowledge. And again, it brings a verse to say how after sanctity comes knowledge. After knowledge comes repentance. And again, a verse is brought for that. After repentance comes forgiveness. Again, and we're really going through, I encourage all of you, you can open up a Sidur, a prayer book, and it really is going through each blessing of the silent Amida and why one comes after the other. So after forgiveness comes Geula, which is redemption. Redemption is the seventh blessing. The seventh blessing, the Gemara says, is hinting to the fact that we will be redeemed in the 7th year, either literally in the 7th year or maybe more figuratively in the 7th era, right? We are in the year 57, right? 5,000. So maybe we're talking about in the year 7,000, or maybe the count starts even earlier than the dates that we have. After redemption comes healing. So we're asking again in Shmona Esrei, we're asking for healing. That's the eighth blessing. Why is it the eighth blessing? The Gemara says because we have circumcision on the eighth day. So we need, right, the eighth day correlates to the eighth blessing. The baby needs healing. The next one is about prosperity on the ninth. Again, and it says that basically the ninth chapter of Psalms of Tehillim speaks about punishment and those who do not, those who people who raise prices are going to be punished. So therefore, there's a correlation between making money in business and the ninth bracha, the ninth blessing. The next is the ingathering of the exiles, kibbutz galuyot. This happens again once you have parnasa, once you have food, once you have a living. This will lead to the ingathering of the exiles, which will lead to justice. The next blessing is about justice, right? When everybody comes to Israel, there will be, we need to return justice to the land. The next bracha is about getting rid of the bad people. Lamal Shinim talks about getting rid of the bad people. The next blessing is Al Hatzadikim, the righteous people, right? After you get rid of the bad people, we're surrounded now by the righteous people. They are elevated. Interestingly, in this blessing, we talk about converts. We talk about all parts of Jewish society, and it's beautiful that talks about the righteousness of converts, which I think is just so beautiful. Where is this all going to happen? The next blessing talks about Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, right? That is the center of religious life, of political life. The next blessing talks about about David, about Moshiach, and that is right the Redeemer, and that will lead to on the top of Daf 18. It leads to prayer, tefillah. Shema Kolenu is the name of the blessing. The blessing talks about Hashem, God listening to our prayers. That comes right. Of course, we're constantly praying, but maybe the idea is that our prayers will answer once Moshiach will come, once the Messiah comes. After that is the blessing of Ritzei, talking about the building of the temple of the Beit HaMikdash. That's the next thing that's going to happen in the redemptive process. After that, we have the blessing of gratitude, right? Modim anachnu. We are grateful to God that we have received everything that God has given us. The next thing is about Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. Right after we're grateful, then Aaron blesses the people, right? Aaron blesses the people after they bring the sacrifices, and that leads to the last blessing, which is shalom, right? Peace. That will bring an end, a peaceful ending to our lives. So this order was established. The Gemara tells us that it was forgotten and then it was arranged again. But it's really fascinating to think about the fact that the words that we're saying in our prayers have been said for over 2,000 years. These are words that have been composed very early on in Jewish history, and it's really something so special. I actually teach a whole class on the Shmona Esrei, on the silent Amida, and there's a lot of, I think, wisdom and intention that I think we can be inspired to think about how we can be, I guess, uplifted in our prayers. So this is something that you can all kind of think about, and especially in our daily prayers. Okay, again, we said that the Megillah needs to be written down and it needs to be read from a parchment. You cannot say it by heart. The question here now, the Gemara talks about on Daf 18, it talks about different languages. If you remember, we have spoken in the past about Greek. Again, in the time of the Gemara, Greek was seen as a very intellectual language, and therefore maybe it's okay if you read it or wrote it in Greek. Others say no, it needs to be, again, as we said, written in Hebrew. Um, Again, the Gemara suggests that maybe you can read it in a foreign language to people who understand that foreign language. But interestingly enough, if you hear the Megillah in Hebrew, but you don't understand it, you have still fulfilled your obligation. So that's just interesting in terms of understanding and hearing, right? There's something about hearing it in Hebrew. Again, I encourage all of you to, if you don't understand Hebrew, maybe follow along in English, but it is important to hear the words in Hebrew. Um, we have the idea of publicizing the miracle, right? Again, in Hanukkah, we talked about publicizing the miracle by lighting the candles in the window or outside so people can see it. We do the same thing. We publicize the miracle on Purim by reading the Megillah in public, right? And that's why many people hear the Megillah in shul, in larger groups, because of this idea of publicizing the miracle. Okay, the Gemara tells us on Daf 18 that if you stopped and started, as long as you pick up where you stopped, that is okay. And from here, because it has the word serugin means either every other or alternating or stopping and starting. And the rabbis didn't understand the word serugin. And interestingly enough, the maidservant of Rav did understand what the word meant, and she explained it to them. And from here, it gets into an entire discussion about words that the sages didn't understand, or the people of the time didn't understand, and she actually did. So I think it's very interesting to see women who are knowledgeable, who are sought after to explain things that people didn't understand, which I think is just really interesting. Okay, the Gemara continues on Daf 18 and tells us that if you waited a very long time in between parts, then you need to start again, right? If you kind of lost focus a little bit and then you start again where you missed, that's okay. But if you wait too long, it's too much and you have to start again. What if the scribe, the sofer, left out letters or words? Then the reader can say those words and it's okay. Meaning, as opposed to when you read from a Torah scroll, the words must be intact in the Torah scroll. If not, you have to bring or fix the letters. You cannot read that the Torah scroll is not valid. If the letters are faded or maybe torn, but they're still recognizable, the Gemara says it's okay to use that Megillah, that scroll. If the reader skipped a verse, you can't go back right at the end and like fill it in. You actually have to go back to the part where you missed and then continue from that verse and on. We said that if you dozed a little bit, that's okay. But if you really fell asleep, you have not fulfilled your obligation. You need to, again, start from the beginning and read it as well. The Gemara says that if you're writing and reading, again, it seems that the Gemara is implying that you're writing it and reading it at the same time, like you're writing the scroll on Purim and reading it on Purim. So the Gemara says that that's okay if you had the intention to be reading it and writing it at the same time. But if you're just you're just the scribe who happens to be writing a Megillah on Purim, that's not okay. You need to have intention to be reading the Megillah for the purpose of fulfilling your obligation. You have to copy the Megillah from another Megillah. Again, when I say Megillah, I mean the actual scroll. So you actually have to copy it. You cannot write it by heart. The Gemara talks about Rabbi Meir, who did write it by heart. They say that he was special, he knew it very well, or maybe it was extenuating circumstances because there was nothing to copy it from. But it is better, or the best way to do it, or the way it needs to be done, is by copying. Since we're talking about writing and writing a Megillah, the scroll itself, the Gemara goes to talk about writing tefillin and the mezuzah. Again, all these things are written on parchment. The Gemara tells us, as opposed to a Torah scroll, a Sefer Torah, and a Megillah, tefillin and mezuzah can be written by heart. Why? Because everybody knows these things by heart. Again, they're much shorter paragraphs, and therefore, or I should say, they are just paragraphs as opposed to an entire book, and therefore they can be written by heart. The Gemara talks about different inks that are not okay. It can't be red. It can't be a certain types of dyes. It must be a black dye. Again, as you see here on the picture, this is a Megillah, a scroll written in black ink on parchment. The top of Daf 19, again, it tells us that it must be written on a parchment. It cannot be written on paper or papyrus. And again, it must be written in Hebrew. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that if, remember, if we talked about, I have a picture from, again, our Daf HaChaim. He actually stopped making videos he stopped making pictures, which is unfortunate, but I did find he did do like an overview of Megillah. So here he has a picture. If you remember, in the beginning of our Masechet, we talked about the difference between walled cities and unwalled cities. So here, if you look at in the background here, in the background, this is the Persian Empire. It extends very far, as we said in the beginning. And Shushan, right? Shushan is the capital city where our story takes place. It is a walled city, and therefore, if you remember, we talked about that in general, the entire empire defeated the enemies on the 13th of Adar, and therefore they celebrated Purim on the 14th of Adar. As opposed to Shushan, again, the capital, they continued fighting for another day, and they only defeated their enemies on the 14th, and therefore they celebrated on the 15th. And that's why we have the concept, again, we've mentioned this in previous classes, we have the concept of Purim as we know it, which is on the 14th, and then we have the concept of Shushan Purim. Again, literally, it happened in Shushan. This is celebrated the next day in walled cities. So again, Jerusalem is a walled city, and therefore in Jerusalem, they celebrate Purim the next day on the 15th. So it really becomes a much longer holiday than the one holiday that you are familiar with. So now the Gemara asks on Daf 19, what happens if you go from an unwalled city to a walled city on Purim, or vice versa, right? I understand where you live is and where you are. You read on that day, but what if you go from one city to another? Now, this is very important, especially if you live in Israel, right? What happens if I want to go visit friends in Jerusalem, right? I live outside of Jerusalem, so I keep Purim on the 14th, but what if I drive to Jerusalem on Purim? Do I actually have to fulfill all the mitzvot of Purim on the 15th as well, because I'm in Jerusalem? So the Gemara tells us that if you plan on going back home the same day, so then you read like home, again, reading the Megillah. But if not, if you plan to sleep over in Jerusalem, so then you need to read like the city you are in, right? And that's why we have the idea of where you sleep the night of Purim is what determines how you celebrate Purim. The Mishnah also tells us that you have to read the whole Megillah, or there's another thought that maybe you only have to read from Ish Yehudi, right? In the second chapter, it starts, the second chapter tells us that there was a Jewish man, and it describes Mordechai. Or the Gemara says even later on, it talks about basically the story, right? After all these things happened, Haman, the wicked, right, starts to plan to kill the Jews. So the Mishnah gives us three different opinions as to where you actually have to read the Megillah from. Okay, the Gemara on Daf 19 tells us, let's go back to the idea of where you are and when you read. So the Gemara tells us that if you return at night, again, that's what determines when you're going to read the Megillah. So the Gemara tells us it goes by where you sleep. What about a villager? If you remember, 2 weeks ago, we discussed if you're a villager that goes in for market day, so then you can read a day before or a day after, not a day after, a day before or 2 days before Purim, in order to free yourself up for Purim itself. So the Gemara says, well, if you're a villager and you go to the city on Purim, maybe you have to read like the city, or no, you read like the villagers, again, earlier. Okay, then so the Gemara again tells us when do you have to read from? Again, like the Mishnah said, either from the beginning or in the second chapter, or when the story actually it's different stages of the story of Purim, right? And the law is, the halacha is, you have to read it from the beginning, right? Vayhi bimei Achashverosh, that's the beginning. You have to start from the beginning till the end. Interestingly, the Megillah is called a sefer, which means a book, and it's called an igeret, which means a letter. So the question is, what's the significance? The Gemara tells us that it's a book in the sense that it must, or I guess a scroll, in the sense that it must be sewn like a Torah scroll. Again, similar to a Torah scroll. Those of you who have ever seen a Torah scroll, it's very long. It's not written on one long piece of parchment. Rather, it's written on different pieces of parchment that are sewn together at the end. It's sewn with sinews. Again, the idea is that you can't, it has to be all animal based. You can't use like cotton thread to sew it. And therefore, so too the Megillah. The Megillah also is quite long, and therefore, generally, a Megillah is written on different pieces of parchment and sewn together like a Torah scroll. It's also considered like a letter in the way that it is stitched, meaning you leave out some space at the top and at the bottom so that when you roll it, it doesn't buckle or tear. Okay. The Gemara tells us that you have to use a specific scroll that is only Megillat Esther, and not a larger scroll that contains other books. Again, in those days, definitely in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, there are no books, right? It's all scrolls. So how did you differentiate, right? Sometimes you had a scroll that had numerous books of the Bible. The Gemara tells us that for Purim, you have to read Megillat Esther from a scroll that is only Megillat Esther, only the book of Esther. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that all can read the Megillah except for somebody who is a deaf mute, meaning can't hear or speak, meaning no communication. Somebody who is insane, shoteh means insane, or a katan, a minor. This group of people, it's important to understand there are different groups of people in the Gemara. This group of people are people who don't have what's called da'at. They don't have, I guess we would say, mental or intellectual capacity like an adult. And therefore, they cannot read from the Megillah. Rabbi Yehuda tells us in the Mishnah, no, a minor can read from the Megillah. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. The Gemara tells us that, again, when we say Shema, you have to hear it. What if you didn't hear it? So some say you have fulfilled your obligations. Others say you didn't fulfill your obligation. Again, we're talking about, right, what if you can't hear? Um, there's a there's a machloket about the minor. Maybe it means that if a minor, again, minor means under the age of 13 for a boy, if they've reached the age of education where they understand what you teach them, so then you have fulfilled your obligation. That works. If they're younger than that, then it doesn't work. What we talked about a deaf mute, meaning someone who can't hear and can't speak, right? Again, is someone who cannot communicate. Again, we're not talking about nowadays somebody who's deaf and can sign or who has a cochlear implant. We're not talking about any of those things. Here we're talking about someone, again, think about even 100 years ago, someone who was deaf really was seen as someone who could not communicate at all, and therefore that's someone who cannot read the Megillah. What about someone, right? The Gemara actually asks, what about someone who's deaf but can speak, right? You can speak, but you can't hear. It says that there's actually machloket with regards to truma when we separate the gifts for the priests. Maybe he can do it because he can say the bracha, right? Again, he can speak, he just can't hear it. So some say that it works, some say it doesn't work, meaning you have to be able to say it and hear it as well. So some say maybe, again, lechatchila, meaning a priori, original, like the best way is that you should be able to hear it and speak, but b'di'eved, meaning like after the fact, if someone did this, then maybe it is okay. So it's interesting to think about the ramifications about that. Okay, the Daf 20 tells us that Rabbi Yehuda says, when I was a child, I read the Megillah and it was fine. Interesting, the Gemara says, well, if you're talking about a time when you were a child, so we can't accept your testimony because you were a child at that time. So it's an interesting, right? The Gemara kind of like in a circular way says we can't use that as proof that a child can read the Megillah, which is just very interesting. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us a list of things that need to be done during the day. Now, it's just important to realize that Megillah, we read it at night and during the day. So here when we talk about Megillah, it's talking about the daytime Megillah must be read during the day. And of course, the Gemara is going to try to define, of course, because in Gemara fashion, we have to define, we don't take things for granted, what is day. So we'll get to that in a minute, but we have a long list on Daf 20 of things that must be done in the daytime. What are these things? Reading the Megillah, Milah, doing circumcision, Tvilah, going to the mikvah. Interesting. Those of you who are familiar in general, nowadays women go to the mikvah at night, but in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, most people went to, again, we're not talking about Nida, but most people went to the mikvah during the day, right? Again, someone who was impure from touching a dead body, from touching an animal, from whatever, all those cases, those people generally went during the day. Other things that are done during the day is what's called hazaya or hazaa, which is the sprinkling of the water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer, of the para aduma. This was part of the ceremony to make someone pure after becoming impure from touching a dead body, right? What's called tumat met. The procedure was that they were impure for 7 days. They were sprinkled with this water, with the ashes, on day 3 and day 7, and then they went to the mikvah after that. So the sprinkling must be done during the day, not at night. Also, a woman who is a zava, if you remember, I think last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, we talked about a zava, which is a woman who has a bloody discharge, not during the time of her period, meaning an unnatural discharge. She will go to the mikvah. We'll discuss in a minute in the Gemara. So she also goes to the mikvah during the day. All these things must be done from sunrise, right? Netzachama, which is sunrise. If it's done at dawn, which is earlier, right? Amud hashachar, that's basically when the sky is getting brighter or lighter before sunrise. Some say that it's still okay, meaning you should wait till sunrise. If you did it when it's not totally night, but when it's dawn, when it's starting to get light, so then maybe in retrospect it is okay. Again, Megillah must be read during the day. As I mentioned, it also must be read the night before. Okay, so now the Gemara goes through all of these things and talks about how basically in all of these things it mentions the word yom, day, or yamim, days. And from here we learn that it must be done during the day, the daytime. The same with going to the mikvah, and the same with the sprinkling. Talking about the zava again, she needs to go to the mikvah again the next day. Basically, when she saw blood twice. Again, this is not. We don't have these laws nowadays. Nowadays, we just have nida laws that have kind of combined these two ideas. But basically, the Gemara tells us that this woman needs to wait till the following day in order to go to the mikvah. Again, what is daytime, right? So the Gemara says when it's dawn, Amud HaShachar, that should be okay because it says in Breshit, in Genesis, it says light, when it's Vayihi or when it's light, it's called Yom. So light equals day. So maybe when it starts to get light, that is enough. The Gemara says no, right? Again, it's better that it is sunrise and not only when it gets light outside. Again, as I mentioned, there are things the Gemara tells us that can be done right. Since we're talking about things that are done during the day, we were talking about when you can start doing it. Now the Gemara talks about how long can you do it. So the Gemara says there are certain things that can be done all day. What does it mean all day? So you can read Megillah all day, right? It doesn't have to be done first thing in the morning. You could do it in the afternoon. You have to say Hallel. Hallel, the prayer of Hallel can be said the whole day. Blowing the shofar, shaking your lulav, saying the musaf prayer, the additional prayer that is also done, can be done all day. Atonement over the bull, that can be done all day. Other atonements on Yom Kippur or for Maser, things that are done in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash. So now we're going to talk about things that have to do with all the avodah, the work, that's the worshiping that's done in the temple, part of the sacrifice. Those can be done all day. So here the Gemara talks about smicha. We've talked about this before, like leaning on the animal, slaughtering the animal, shchita, tnufa, when you raise up the sacrifice, hagasha, which means when you bring the sacrifice to touch the altar. Again, all of these things are things that are done in the temple. They're done during the day. Kmitza, which was taking from the grain offering, burning of the offering, milika, which is how they killed the birds for the bird offering. When you catch the blood, that has to be done during the day or all day. Sprinkling the blood, again, other things that were done, all the ceremonies that were done in the temple. So the sotah ceremony, which is the adulteress, the egla arufa, which is when they didn't know if, again, a dead body was found in between two towns, and they don't know which town it needs to take responsibility for that. They would do a whole ceremony in a valley between those two villages or towns. That ceremony is done again during the day. The ceremony of the leper of the Metzorah, also done during the day. And since we're talking about day, now let's go to night. What are things that are done during the night? So the Gemara tells us the Omer. Remember when we talked about in Masechet Psachim, the barley sacrifice that was sacrificed between Pesach and Shavuot. So they cut down that barley, they harvested it at night. Um, Again, burning certain sacrificial parts again are done during the night. And the Mishnah concludes that all of these commandments, things that are done during the day, can be done all day, and things that are done at night can be done all night. Okay, let's get to the Gemara. The Gemara brings different verses to prove how each one of these things need to be done during the day. Again, as I said, they all have the word bayom on the day. Again, so we have this idea that it is done all day. Daf 21 again talks about that the omer is brought at night, or not brought, is harvested at night. It is sacrificed during the day. Okay. Other things that are done during the day is the changing of the showbread, of the lechem hapanim, and the frankincense that was placed on the table. That can be done all day. Things that are done all night, we learned about Korban Pesach, right? We talked about Korban Pesach only being till the middle of the night, till Chatzot. Here there's opinion that it can be eaten all night. So there are two different opinions there. And with that, we finish the second chapter. So kol hakavod, everyone. Let's continue to the third chapter. The Gemara talks about now, the Mishnah is going to talk about reading the Megillah. So we talked about what we have to read. So now we're going to talk about how we read it. So the Mishnah tells us the Megillah can be read standing or sitting. More than one person can read the Megillah. Some have a custom to say a blessing at the end. We're going to talk about everyone says a blessing in the beginning, but some people have a custom to say a blessing at the end. Some don't. Nowadays, we do have a custom to say a blessing at the end. Since we're talking about reading the Megillah, we're going to talk a lot about reading the Torah scroll as well. On Mondays and Thursdays and on Shabbat afternoon, we are going to read 3 Aliyot, right? Aliyah is a portion that is read while one person is called up, right? Each Aliyah means that you're calling up a different person to either read from the Torah or make the blessing, and someone else, the reader, will read the Torah scroll. So the rest of the Mishnah is going to tell us how different days of the Jewish calendar have a different number of aliyot. Again, right, to remind us, on Shabbat, we read the Torah portion. It's divided into 7 sections, right? Each section is referred to as an aliyah. The word aliyah means to go up, right? Because one person is called up to say the blessing over that portion. So the Gemara tells us that Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat afternoon, we're going to read 3 aliyot, and there's no haftarah. Haftorah is a portion that is read after the Torah, it's read from the prophets. And that is not always the case. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. The Gemara tells us that the first person and then the last person make the blessings, but not the person in the middle. That's not the case nowadays. Nowadays, every person who goes up makes the blessing before and after. On the Rosh Chodesh, on the first of the month, or on the intermediary days of the festival, Chol HaMoed, we read 4 aliyot, no haftorah. So now the Mishnah tells us there's a rule. If you have a musaf tefillah, meaning if on that day we add an additional prayer, then, and it's not a festival, meaning Rosh Hashanah or Sukkot or Pesach, you read 4 aliyot. If it's a festival, you read 5 aliyot. If it's Yom Kippur, you read 6 aliyot. And if it's Shabbat, you read 7. The Gemara tells us, right, on Shabbat there's Haftorah. You cannot, right, on these, you cannot do less, but you can add more. Okay, let's go to the Gemara on Daf 21. The Gemara tells us that when you read from the Torah, you must stand. It's learned from Moshe. Moshe stood when God taught him Torah, and therefore you should stand. Interestingly, the Gemara talks about teachers should stand while teaching Torah, but throughout the generations have gotten weaker, and unfortunately, sometimes we sit instead of stand. So I apologize for that. But we still respect the Torah. The Torah, only one person can read it at a time. One person can read it, and in those days, they had somebody translating the Gemara as well. And therefore, we want to make sure that everybody understands what they're being read. The Megillah, as we said, can have more than one person reading it. We talked about there is a blessing that is said before you read the Megillah. You say, Baruch Ata Hashem, right? God is blessed, or blessed be God, right? For the mitzvah, the commandment of Mikra Megillah, of reading the Megillah, and She'asa Nisim, right? That God did miracles for us, and Shehechiyanu, right? We are grateful that we have gotten to this day. Okay, 3 aliyot during the week. Why are there? Excellent. Zohar talks about Yemenites translating it. Excellent. Reading it in Aramaic. Yes, excellent. We're going to talk about Yemenites in a little bit as well. But 3 aliyot. Why do we read 3 aliyot during the week? What is it commemorating? So one opinion is Torah, Nevi'im, Ktuvim, meaning the 3 sections of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. Or maybe it's the 3 parts of the nation, right? Priests, Kohanim, Levi'im, and Yisrael, meaning everybody else. The Gemara tells us you need to read at least 10 verses when you read from the Torah. Why at least 10 verses? Again, 10 being a very special number, the 10 commandments, or the 10 words, utterances that God created the world with. What if, so now, okay, what if, let's say there are not enough, so let's say from 10, how do we do 10? The first aliyah reads 4 verses, then the next 3, and then the next 3, because the first one is maybe the most important. Therefore, it gets 4 verses. And interestingly, the Gemara has a rationale that maybe the middle one is more important, or maybe the last one is more important. Each learned from different things in our in the Gemara as well. Okay, the first person says the blessing of Asher Bachar Banu, right? Praising God that He chose us, right, to give us. He chose us as the chosen nation. The last one says Asher Natan Lanu. Again, we praise God that He gave us the Torah. Nowadays, every person makes the blessing before and after. Interestingly, the Gemara explains why is that? Because we're concerned about people coming late to shul and missing the first blessing, or people leaving early and missing the last blessing. I think it's just fascinating that literally 2,000 years ago, people were also coming late to shul and leaving early. It was a problem, I guess, that they've been facing for thousands of years, and therefore they instituted that every person who goes up makes the blessing lest you miss the blessing. Okay, the next section is going to talk about how we break up these aliyot, as I mentioned. So I took a picture actually of my Tanakh. You can see here, this is what a Torah scroll will look like, even though, I took it from my Tanakh. But what's interesting to see, for those of you who either have not seen a Tanakh written this way, is you can see how there are paragraphs. These are called parshiot. parshiot, we're used to the word, or parsha, right? We're used to the word parsha, meaning the Torah portion of the week. But here it means one paragraph, right? It's usually split up because of topic. When you move to the next paragraph, it's another topic. So the Gemara is going to talk about how do we break up different paragraphs. Um, so here, as we said, each aliyah needs to be at least 3 verses, and therefore, okay. So here, the Gemara is going. Well, we'll get to it in a minute. Let's do the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf 21. The Mishnah tells us that on Rosh Chodesh, and this is the picture that I brought for you. This is the reading of the Torah for Rosh Chodesh. It's from the book of Numbers, from Bamidbar, and it talks about the sacrifices. The first paragraph talks about the daily sacrifice. The second paragraph is talking about the sacrifices that are brought on Shabbat. And the last paragraph talks about the sacrifices brought on Rosh Chodesh, on the new month. So this needs to be divided up into 4 aliyot, right? Because we said Rosh Chodesh is 4 aliyot. And now we have a problem, because if you see, the first section has 8 verses. And the question is, how do I break that up into 2? Because the next section has 2 verses and then 5, which is a total of 7. And we can't only read 2 verses, meaning each one has to be at least 3 verses. And says, to make it a little bit more complicated, you can't, let's say if you would read the second paragraph by itself, you can't just add, or maybe you can, we'll see in a minute, maybe you can't just read one other verse in the next paragraph, because you can't just start the paragraph and leave it off with just one verse. So anyway, it gets complicated. The Gemara tells us on Daf 22 that we had a similar discussion. I don't know if you remember, when in Masechet Ta'anit, we talked about how every day they would read the story of the creation of the world. And we had a similar issue where we had 5 verses that needed to be split up into 2 parts. And again, we said you have to have 3 in each part. How do you divide 5 into 2 with 3, right? So there are 2 opinions. One is the first person reads verse 1, 2, 3. The second person reads verse 3, 4, 5, meaning we repeat one verse. The next opinion is that you actually break up the middle verse. So one person reads 1, 2, half of 3, and the next person reads half of 3, 4, and 5. The law actually is that you repeat the verse, and that's actually what we do when we read on Rosh Chodesh. We actually go back and repeat the verses that we already read. So that's just an interesting practical question, and what we do in reality. The next question the Gemara asks us is, what about Tanit Tzibur? When we have a fast day, do we read 3 or 4 aliyot? And the Gemara basically at the end tells us that we do read 3 and not 4 aliyot. Because again, it seems that on a fast day, this is also a work day. We don't want to keep people in the shul too long, and therefore you read 3 aliyot. The Gemara tells us on Daf 22 that as you increase in, I would say, special things of the day, or maybe more mitzvot, or as the day becomes more special, you add more aliyot, as we mentioned in the Mishnah, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, as we mentioned before. Just interesting, at the bottom of Daf 22, we have the topic of what's called in Hebrew Nefilat Apayim, what we call Tachanun nowadays. It is a prayer that is said after the silent Amida, where the word Nefilat Apayim actually means to fall on your face. We nowadays do it. If those of you have been to a shul during the week, you will see people actually bend down and lean on their hand. It's a sign of great sadness. Again, we're begging God to forgive us and accept our prayer. So it's a sign of supplication. Interestingly, we see at the bottom of Daf 22 that originally it was done as actually bowing down on the floor, and that cannot be done on a stone floor. And there's a whole discussion there of Rav who didn't do it, and one explanation is because he actually really lied down on the floor, and one cannot do that on a stone floor. Nowadays, we actually just lean our head on our hands, and that can be done wherever you are. So that's just the idea of nifilat apayim. Okay, Daf 23 talks about again, different reading, again, different aliyot for different days, right? We have 3, we have during the week, we have 5 on the festivals, we have 7 on Shabbat. What's this based on? This very interesting. Why would we have 3, 5, and 7? The Gemara tells us that it's based on maybe Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. It's actually 3 verses. The first verse has 3 words, the second has 5, and the third has 7. So it's an interesting correlation to that. Or it's talking about the guards and the advisors of a king. Also, you have 3, 5, and 7. Where does 6 come from on Yom Kippur? It's the advisors that stood next to Ezra. So again, this idea of 6. Then it says, okay, so it says here in the Gemara that anyone can be counted, meaning anybody can come up and read from the Torah, even a minor or a woman, but women shouldn't be called up to the Torah because it's not honorable for the congregation. And I actually already received an email from one of our students here who asked, what does this mean? It's not honorable. What's going on? It's a much larger conversation, but the term that's used here is kavod hatzibur, right? It's not honorable for the congregation. What does that mean? So people have explained that the concept is that why would they call up a woman to read from the Torah? It must be that nobody in the congregation, meaning no man in the congregation, could read, and therefore they're calling up a woman, and that's disgraceful to the congregation that no men can read, only a woman can read, and therefore women shouldn't be called up to the Torah. This is quite complicated, as I see from some reactions here. It is not very satisfying. There is a lot to say here. I think that this concept of dishonor to the congregation, there's a question if that can be redefined nowadays. Nowadays that men are educated, women are educated, women want a role in the ritual. I think it's become quite complicated. Again, please, ask your local rabbi, but definitely I would say in the Orthodox community is very complicated. I think in the Reform community, it is obvious that women are called up. I think in the Orthodox community, whether you cite slippery slope, it will lead to other things, or anyway, I think it's a more complicated discussion, but this is where it comes from. So you should know that it is here, and a larger conversation for another day. Just to mention, we mentioned the idea of the Haftorah, which is read after the Torah portion. It is the portion read from the prophets. The Gemara tells us that it needs to be at least 21 verses. Why 21 verses? Because as we said, when you read the Torah, it was 7 parts, 7 aliyot. Each needed to be a minimum of 3. So 7 times 3 is 21, which is just interesting where it comes from. The last mission that we're going to do today is the idea of minyan. Again, a little bit complicated maybe, but the idea that 10 men make a minyan. Minyan being 10 men. Women are not again in Orthodox Judaism, we do not count women as part of the minyan, the quorum of 10. Um, Actually, because of this. Here on this Gemara on Daf 23, we have the source of where this concept comes from. We have this concept of God says that he will be sanctified from within the congregation. What is a congregation? It's actually learnt from the spies. We know that there were 12 spies. Two of them were good and brought back good news. 10 of them were brought back bad news, but this 10 is seen as a congregation. It is 10 men, and therefore the Gemara tells us that a quorum of 10 is 10 men. So this is the source for minyan. Again, I think as women, this is challenging, and we have to kind of think about what that means. But here the idea is that doesn't mean that women are less sanctified or women are less important. I really do not believe that. But I think that here we have a certain law. The law is that 10 men facilitate the saying of certain parts of the prayer, what we call dvarim shebikdusha, things that need that have extra sanctity. These are things like Baruch Hu, like the repetition of the Amida. These are all things that are done within a quorum of men, meaning when there's a minyan, and that comes from here from this daf. So I think it's just interesting to understand where these things come from. And again, I think it's a larger conversation for the modern world. And I think as women, where we fit in. And really, trust me, I believe strongly we fit in. Again, I feel within the framework of the law, we have to kind of figure out what that means for each and every one of us. So again, very interesting discussion that we can continue. Another time. So wishing everybody a great day. Lynn actually added this idea of minyan being the head of the household, which is interesting. That was definitely the men. Could be. Again, here we're talking about an Eidah, a congregation, and that is seen as the men. So, yes, again, larger conversation. So, thank you all. And to be continued. I think actually we're going to finish Megillah next week. If I'm not mistaken, I think we finish next week. I think that according to the calendar, we actually finished learning Megillah on Thursday, but I think I'm going to finish it with you on Tuesday night. So I'll try to get ahead so that we can finish it all together on Tuesday night. And then the next week, we will start the next Masechet after that. So wishing everyone a wonderful week, a Chodesh Tov. This is a new month of Shvat. So wishing everyone a great week, and see you next week.
Chodesh Tov. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.